All right, so a little bit of background. This original presentation was given to my historical society, so it was originally given to people who kind of knew the area a little bit. So I had to make a couple edits to it, especially a background to kind of explain. So this presentation was on the narrow gauge railroads of Keweenaw County, Michigan. Now, Michigan's copper country is located on the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. It's a peninsula in the Upper Peninsula, and a lot of geological history that it's very hard to explain on my end, something I don't understand very well. But essentially, this peninsula is a giant lava flow, and it formed native copper, which is 99% native copper, or 99% pure copper with a 1% silver impurity. So it's a little bit different than the other ores you might find in places like Arizona or Utah, which is copper sulfides, which is copper bound to other minerals at an atomic level. Um, so it kind of formed this long belt along the peninsula that kind of stretches all the way into Minnesota, but the more productive region of it was in the Keweenaw Peninsula itself. Copper was first discovered by the Native Americans, unknown tribe about 10,000 years ago. They were doing relatively primitive mining and they would use the tools they found, or they would make tools out of the copper they found. And it would take until 1766 for British explorers to discover the actual copper. The copper that they were originally going after was chunks of copper, large chunks. Some were up to the size of a school bus, 100 tons. But later on, around the Civil War, the larger chunks of copper were becoming depleted. They're focusing more on the amygdaloid copper, which you can see here at the right, was little from the size of a grain of sand up to the size of maybe your fist chunks of copper that could be found. It required a lot more industrial processing. It required crushing. It required a stamp mill before it could be turned into actual silk copper ingots. So it was a little bit more of a process, but it was a lot more profitable than the actual mass copper mining. So Keweenaw County was the first place where they did really any of this mining. The Cliff Mine was the first mine in Keweenaw County and the first copper mine in Michigan. Was found in 1845, where they were mining those large copper chunks. Around 1870, the Cliff Mine began to die, but at the same time, a lot of these other mines began to pop up that were focusing on the amygdaloid and conglomerate lodes that had the small pieces of copper. There were many, many mines in Keweenaw County. I would say north of 100, and I'm only going to cover actually five because these were the five that had narrow gauge railroads. A little bit of some other information. Terms that are kind of local to the copper country that might not be familiar. Terms like rock. Rock is ore. Poor rock is tailings. A rock car is an ore car, so on and so forth. A lot of the structures are, instead of a locomotive roundhouse, it would just be called the locomotive house. A hoist house would be a hoist house, so on. Everything was a house. Every structure was referred to as a house. So I did this in the chronologic order of the dates these railroads were built. And first up is the Alloway Mine Railroad. It ran 2.5 miles from Alloway to Hills Creek, where they had a stamp mill. So the stamping process, which is the secondary process where you crush the rock down to a mineral concentrate, is really, really reliant on water and gravity. So they usually built these stamp mills along water, especially rivers. So they had to build their stamp mill away from the mine. on Hills Creek, which provided a decent water source. The Alloway mine started around 1869, but it wasn't until 1872 that they really started to turn a profit. In 1873, the price of copper had kind of rebounded after a post-Civil War crash, and it was profitable enough that they determined they needed a railroad and a new stamp mill. So they constructed a stamp mill on Hills Creek. The railroad was 3-foot gauge. It started off with a just a standard 260 Baldwin, pretty much identical to those that were used by the East Broad Top and the Denver Rio Grande. There are not many photos of the Alloway mine. This is actually the only known photo of the Alloway mine, which was taken about 50 years later when the mine had suffered a pretty catastrophic fire and burned a lot of the infrastructure. So this is the stamp mill on Hills Creek. It it was it was a pretty large stamp mill for the time. This is this is a David Fletcher drawing of one of the Baldwin 12D or 260s. It was pretty similar to this. The only difference between this and the between the East Broad Top and the Alloway mines was that they had an 8-wheel tender. What's weird about the Alloway mine is that there are no real photographs of the mine or the railroad, but drawings of all the rolling stock, drawings of the locomotives still exist in various archives. So in 1884, they had to purchase a second locomotive, as the first locomotive, the Baldwin I had previously mentioned, was pretty thoroughly worn out. So they went to Machine Works and purchased a 064. It was actually the last Mason locomotive built for the death of William Mason. Supposedly, he was inspecting this locomotive on the ready track at Mason Machine Works when he caught a cold, and at his pretty elderly age, he was bedridden, passed away because of it. it it's pretty strange that mechanical drawings of all these locomotives survive, but no photos. But they removed the stack off this locomotive so it could fit under the pretty extensive snow sheds that the mine had. This area got a lot of snowfall in the winter, so they had to improvise. The locomotive, the Mason Bogie locomotive, was leased to the Centennial Mine around 1900. And I guess I lost that photo. Oh, there it is. Uh, it only lasted there for a couple years before it returned back to the Alloway Mine, where it languished until 1911, where in the previously mentioned fire, it and the other locomotive were burned inside the Roundhouse. But at this point, they're pretty out of date. There are really not many 3-foot gauge railroads left in this area, so the locomotives were both scrapped. This is an illustration of one of the rock cars that they used. So the second railroad was the Lac La Belle and Calumet Railroad, built for the Conglomerate Mining Company, which ran 7.25 miles between Delaware and Lac La Belle, Michigan, on the east side of the peninsula. It was built in 1883 and was a pretty extensive operation. They had sank a lot of money into this. So originally, in 1881, when the Conglomerate Mine took over the Delaware Mine, they had built a series of tracks connecting each shaft to a nearby stamp mill, and they purchased a Porter locomotive to switch between these shafts. But the stamp mill, which was built during the Civil War, was considered pretty inadequate and out of date by 1883. So they built a pretty extensive stamp mill with 4 stamps out on Lake Superior, and they built as I mentioned, a 7.25 mile railroad to connect to it. The railroad had two Baldwin locomotives, 280s. They're 1024Es, pretty similar to the ones used out west and again, on the East Broad Top. They had 32 roar cars, six flat cars, and two box cars. So it was a pretty big operation for an isolated location. But this railroad only operated for a year before price of copper really kind of fell and the railroad ceased to function and the mine ceased to function. All of the equipment sat at the mine until about 1886 when all of the equipment was kind of sold off to local operations. The porter was sold to W.A. Holmes, who had a logging operation near Escanaba, Michigan. And the 280s, David Fletcher did a wonderful illustration of these locomotives for me. One was sold to the Deerfield River Railroad in Vermont, and the other one was sold to the Mineral Range Railroad, where it became their number 7. These locomotives had pretty long lives, and I believe the one that went to Vermont on the Deerfield Railroad actually lasted until roughly around the Depression, after it ran on several logging routes. This one's my personal favorite, the Copper Falls Mining Company. So the Copper Falls mine found itself in a unique position where they're able to dig a mile-long tunnel or adit, which is a horizontal opening to their mine, directly to their stamp mill. And they utilized steam power and steam locomotives underground in this mile-long tunnel to haul ore. They also incorporated steam hoists underground in what were called winzes, or a shaft that did not connect to the surface. This is another photos of this area were pretty rare. This is actually the only known photo of the Copper Falls mine. It was taken at the mouth of the adit in 1879. So the hoists were they utilized the hoists on the incline shafts where they would lower and raise the tram cars. The weight of a loaded car would usually pull the weight of empty cars going up, but steam power was needed to subsist if it wasn't enough weight to pull the cars up. When these cars were made to the main haulage level, they would be taken originally by mule and then later by steam locomotive out to the surface. And to this day, two boilers and hoists still survive underground at this mine. So the locomotive they had was a single Porter 040. It was designed specifically for operation underground. It had only 5 foot of vertical and horizontal clearance, so it was a very small locomotive. This locomotive operated on and off until about 1893, and in 1899, a pretty substantial flood had burst through the mine and essentially wrecked it beyond use. And the porter sat outside in the machine shop next to the stamp mill until it was scrapped during World War II. So later on, the Arnold Mining Company would purchase the stamp mill from the Copper Falls mine, and they built a railroad 2.5 miles long to connect to their mine at Arnold. It was a pretty small operation. The Arnold mine only had two shafts, and only one was actually utilized. They had a pretty small surface plant. They only had a dry house and machine shop. The stamp mill was just reused from the Copper Falls mine. They had to reorganize it in a way that would allow the cars to run above instead of directly into the stamp mill. So the route this this Arnold and Eagle Harbor Railroad ran along was pretty spectacular. It had a direct view of Lake Superior the entire time. So the Copper Falls Mill was the ultimate destination of this railroad, and it only lasted from 1898 until 1900 when the aforementioned flood. The same flood also destroyed the stamp mill and had knocked machinery off of its foundations, and the mine was unable to recover after that. They had originally intended to connect to Eagle Harbor, where there had been a small series of coal docks and other various shipping entities available, but they were never able to really connect. And Eagle Harbor itself proved inadequate for larger ships, which would have been able to supply the coal. And ultimately, this would be one of the major causes of death of the flood would be a lack of fuel in the winter of 1899. The railroad only operated a single 040, again from Baldwin. No known photos were taken of this locomotive, and it was a pretty rare Baldwin class. But there is a photo of a similar locomotive used out in the anthracite region of Pennsylvania. And this is it, taken here. So they had 8 ore cars, or rock cars. And surprisingly, all 8 of these rock cars were shipped by barge after the railroad shut down to the Quincy mine, where at least 3 of these cars still survive to this day. Quincy and Torch Lake car number 134 actually is still right on display, right behind the hoist house, which is a pretty popular tourist destination now in Michigan. And this is one of the original Arnold and Eagle Harbor cars. So this comes to our last mine, the Phoenix Mine and Gratiot River Railroad. So the Phoenix Mine is another one of the mines that saw revitalization after 1900. So they never actually mined at the Phoenix Mine. They utilized the St. Clair and Robbins or West Vein mines, which had tapped into a pretty productive amygdaloid vein. They also constructed a stamp mill on Eagle River, roughly a mile and a half away from Phoenix itself. But the Phoenix mine site itself would act as the central hub for the railroad. They had the locomotive house, carpenter shops, and all the other various outshops for the mine itself. So the most productive of these mines was the Robbins or West Vein mine. It had a pretty extensive surface plant. So this railroad was built with the idea of using leftover equipment for the recently shut down Hancock and Calumet narrow gauge railroad. They had roughly 15 ore cars, all purchased secondhand from the Hancock and Calumet, which maintained the Hancock and Calumet lettering. And they had a second-hand Plymix locomotive, which they purchased also from the Hancock and Calumet, which was built in 1898. This operation only lasted until about 1906, when the whole thing was scrapped, other than rails directly around Phoenix. The locomotive would be sent down to several southern logging and gravel roads. And to this day, this Climax locomotive still actually survives in Romare, Texas. That's it. We'll move on to questions now. What's up?
Uh, Most of these operations you are describing, they seem pretty isolated. What were their ways of transporting the finished material to outside sources?
So to get to the smelters, typically they'd move the mineral concentrates from the mills by sleigh in the winter or wagon, but also ships would be utilized, especially barges when the weather was good. They could just load it right into a barge and take it down to Houghton. where the smelters were located. And uh, it was pretty hard getting coal to these operations too. Even the ones that had direct ports struggled with shortages of coal and supplies. So a lot of them ended up burning wood.
Interesting.
Any other questions?
I've got another one if no one else has one.
Looks like John has a question he's typing out. I guess while he's typing it out, go ahead, Austin.
Um, we've talked about this before. Many of the rock cars came from different builders. Is there, and some still unknown, is there a generalized list of most of the builders that these rock cars came from?
Um, so Wells French seems to be the most common one.
And that was
Uh,
Arnold and Eagle Harbor cars, right? Too.
yeah, and I think the Peninsular Carco built most of the Z-braced rock cars that the Phoenix mine used, but I'm not sure about the Alloy mine or the Lac La Belle and Calumet, or yeah, the Lac La Belle and Calumet or the Conglomerate mine. Their cars in the photos I've seen of the Lac La Belle and Calumet seem pretty similar to the ore cars used on the mineral range, but it's not easy to tell.
Hmm.
So John's question was asking about the Copper Falls mine, so I'll bring that slide back up. So they did have shafts that connected to the surface, which acted as air shafts, but they actually had three inclined winze shafts that they used for main haulage. But they had several air shafts, especially from the older mine itself. So that's what they would utilize if there were any problems. And there were problems. They did suffer a pretty catastrophic collapse before they implemented the steam power with the locomotive. But I'm not entirely sure how much that affected productivity. I think it was on the I guess you could call it the southeast side of the mine where it was less productive.
How much of it is accessible today?
I'm not sure. I I I've never been in the Copper Falls mine and I would love to, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. And I
Well,
think it's also not legal.
yeah, but you show the pictures taken in from inside, so assumedly at one point someone crossed the legal boundaries to go deep
Yeah,
into it.
the Copper Falls mine was a pretty popular local kind of hangout. Um, People would go down. I've heard stories of people playing football underground. It was such
Holy
an
shit.
extensive mine, but they have it pretty well closed off. There's not really any openings that are accessible as of today. John asked what the safety records for these mines were. So there were a lot of minor injuries, hands crushed. Well, I guess today they'd be pretty catastrophic injuries, but back in the day, uh, there were pretty typical. Um, the area was actually considered pretty safe to work in compared to a lot of other regions because the rock in the area itself is so hard that it isn't known for collapses. And not a lot of, like in the mine that used steam power, there was no reported problems of asphyxiation or smoke inhalation. I I haven't really read much other than a lot of records of people falling down shafts. That seems to be a pretty repeated theme is people falling down open shafts.
And he's stuck in the well.
Yes, John Lemons asked, would the harder rock mean that the actual ore was more difficult to extract? Yes. That was one of the key reasons. The reason that it's not mined today is because of how hard the rock is itself. It is very hard to extract, but back in the day, when you could find something that needed very little actual processing other than the mining itself, it was pretty profitable.
So Matt, there wasn't a roasting process that they could extract the copper from the rock?
So originally they had implemented that. That's 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 kind of a pre-Civil War process that they had abandoned.
Mm.
What technology came around during the Civil War called the Blake's Jaw Crusher, and the
Hmm.
Blake's Jaw Crusher kind of replaced, needing to roast the rock to make it softer with just mechanical, a crusher. And that's where the rock house kind of came in. The rock house is where the rock would be crushed down from run of the mine ore sizes, which were I would say, up to a couple 100 pounds, down to, gravel sized, maybe a little bit bigger than gravel, like maybe fist sized rocks.
Yeah, because I know in some other areas, especially in silver, they would have to roast even though they were using crushing in hard rock. And that lasted well into the 1890s in some places.
So the last I know they called them kiln houses originally in the area
Yeah.
where they would roast the ore. The last mine that really I know of that did that was the Central Mine, and the Central Mine shut down in 1899. It was pretty profitable, but it's just had used such they had not really upgraded their equipment since the Civil War, and that was one of the reasons they shut down. But the way stuff was, the way the mineral geology was around this area, the roasting process was just not as efficient as just crushing.
Cool.
Especially
Thanks.
since the copper it was native copper and not copper, sulfides.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
Yeah, sure. I got one. I'm a little more familiar with mines out west. Sort of, you kind of get a flow of, immigrant of the month or the year. Who was mostly staffing these mines, and also, what were the numbers of people employed kind of in their heyday?
So originally, starting back when they first started mining the area in 1845, it was Cornishmen. And that kind of repeated until roughly around the Civil War, when labor shortages caused by, obviously the Civil War, the mining companies started hiring people from a lot of Scandinavians, especially Finns. And gradually, by around 1910, Finns had largely replaced the Cornishmen who had originally worked in the mines. And so mostly Cornishmen and Finns. The area is actually pretty popular with Finnish tourists now because of how similar it is to Finland, naturally and with the population. You can drive around the area today and every other American flag will have a Finnish flag underneath it. And in terms of employment, these mines specifically, since they had railroads, they're pretty large operations. They'd have a couple hundred people, but some of the smaller mines might only have 30 or 40.
Yes, do tell us about this pastry.
Pasty, everybody loves a pasty. So the pasty was one of the early things that came over the Cornish miners. It's a meat pie that has carrots, potatoes, rutabaga, and minced meat wrapped inside a pastry. So the miners would pack it in their lunch pail with tea, and the tea and the pasty would keep each other warm. So you might be working in a 10-hour shift, 5 hours through your shift, your pasty would still at least be lukewarm. There's still a lot of places up there today that serve pasties, and they are delicious. If you ever find yourself in the copper country of Michigan, a shout out to Krups. They have the best pasties.
The other thing you should mention, Matt, is that the crust where they fold it was intended as a handle. It was usually not eaten back in the day. And I only know that because my father-in-law came from Houghton. And so he ate more than his share of those things.
I've heard that, but from what I've been told is that they would eat the crust too.
Probably eat anything down there.
Yeah. The only thing they didn't eat is they would often share with the rats because they considered mine rats to be their friends. Because the first sign of something going wrong, and the rats would be the first ones out of the mine, so you'd know to follow them.
Right.
So they actually didn't have a lot of dust since the area is pretty naturally wet. There was a lot of moisture in the air, and the mine tours that I've done today, relative humidity is probably 80 to 100%. It's just more the mine mud sticks to you, so you would be pretty muddy.
What were temperatures like in mines this deep up in the upper country?
Um, the Quincy mine, the mine that gives the T-shirt or they give the tours today, and they have a T-shirts, and I believe the T-shirts say the temperature underground is 43 degrees. So, it, I'll say 43 degrees at pretty normal levels, but closer to the surface, I know it's probably closer to around 50. And as you go down further, and as these mines went further, so the deepest I believe went down to 10,000 feet. It could get up into the 90s as you got closer to the core of the earth, and it was
Closer to hell, right?
pretty miserable. Yeah, yeah, in Fahrenheit.
So Storm has a hand raised, but I can't tell if that was just a mistake because he hasn't joined the voice chat.
Yeah, I'm not Storm. I guess if you have a question, you might want to type it out. Oh, there we go.
Storm has fallen asleep.
I assume
Trying to
so.
think.
Yeah.
Trying to think if I have any more questions or comments I wanted to add. So I assume just EBT got brought up a lot simply because they had a fairly large operation in the East and they were operating, and therefore other people joined onto their orders when it came to rolling stock.
So it's just weird because the East Broad Top shares a lot of similarities with these mines. So the original drawing that survives of the 12D Baldwin is actually of the Alloway mine, Baldwin. So, and I guess the reason I brought up the East Broad Top is it's a more familiar railroad to a lot of people, and saying the Denver and Rio Grande gets boring. Sorry, Josh.
Good thing you didn't get banned yet for saying that.
No, the Rio Grande sucks. Cool. Well,
You're
if
gonna
we
hear it first, folks.
sorry, what was that?
I got one last question. Is available.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
What were the miners? I mean, I know that it was not uniform, but what was the best attire they would wear when going underground?
They typically wore a bodysuit or kind of like a jumpsuit. It's kind of hard to describe. There's a little bit more uniformity in Michigan mining compared to out west or in coal mining. They they just typically wore I think it was a brown colored jumpsuit and a hard boiled leather cap, which is better than not wearing anything for productivity, but it's only really good if you bump your head against a rock. It's not going to save you if anything falls. The mining captains, as they called, because of the Cornish connection, everything was nautical terms. All the mines were measured in fathoms and not feet, and all the terms were captain and other, as I said, nautical. The captains would wear white jumpsuits so they could be distinguished from the other miners, and the captains were the underground foremen, you could call them.
If they wore white, how long did that last for in the mines if it's completely muddy down there?
Well, you're a foreman, so are you really doing any work?
That's fair.
That
Does any?
oh,
Oh,
sorry.
go ahead.
That hard-boiled leather cap, is that pretty similar to the kind of late 1890s football helmet?
No.
Hmm.
Let me see if I can bring up a picture of it. I've been trying to get one made for myself for an outfit, but kind of imagine a fireman's helmet
Mm-hmm.
with the flat
Is it
brim.
basically is it a bowler basically? Because that's
Hmm.
what the bowler was originally invented for, as a safety helmet of sorts.
No, it was really, I guess the best I could say is just really a fireman's helmet, like or not a plastic, but the early fireman's helmets, and it also had a bracket at the front so you could mount like a candle, or they later had paraffin wax lamps that looked like teapots. But yeah, I really would like to get one for myself, like a new made one, just because I want to get a mining outfit together. But getting original ones to find and make measurements of is not easy.
All right. Well, if don't have any more questions, I think we can wrap up the recording for tonight and then continue the conversation in the general chat. So thanks
I'm
everybody
fine
for
with
being
that.
here, and thanks Matt for presenting tonight.
Great job, man. Good presentation.
Yes,
All
thank
right, I'm
you.
gonna move over to the general chat.